Sometimes when new information crosses our path, especially in an industry or in a practice that we've been invested in, practicing, learning about for a number of years, and that information is counterintuitive to what we're taught, sometimes we have an ego flare and be like, nuh-uh, that doesn't land with me. But those are also opportunities to find out why that ego flare happened or what that information is. And so today I'm joined by Yogi Aaron, a beautiful human being who's been practicing and teaching yoga for almost 30 plus years, as an author, as a podcast host, and is a creator of a practice of yoga called, or an understanding called AYAMA. And AYAMA stands for Applied Yoga Anatomy Muscle Activation. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how Aaron came across the AYAMA idea and how it links with muscle activation. But a lot of his messaging and his passion right now is to get people to stop stretching. And coming from a yoga teacher, that's a very counterintuitive message. And again, those ego flares pop up like, nope. But as we start to listen to and see how that information lands, there's a lot of opportunity for growth. And that's what I got from this conversation was growth opportunities, subjects to grow with, ideas to maybe move past. And, just with any information that comes in that's new, it's your discernment whether or not that lands with you, and to figure out how that works into what you're currently teaching or practicing. So if this conversation is counterintuitive to some of what you were taught and might be kind of triggered by some of that, I challenge you to be inquisitive and to maybe find out why that triggering came up, and if we can find some information within this conversation or within that triggering to lead you to a deeper understanding. I hope you get something out of the conversation. We'll see you on the other side. But first, a message from our sponsor. Summer is a beautiful time of the year for outdoor events in the Northwest. And for the second year in a row, Camo Lionheart and Kyla Geese of Sacred Dwelling are joining together to bring you an outdoor event. This year, this event's called Mandala, tending to our inner life cycles. It's going to be on July 8th from 9:30 to 6:30 at Sacred Dwelling over in Monroe. It's a day-long immersive community experience for personal growth, inner healing, connection through participation, ceremonial co-creation. We have 5 high-caliber facilitators bringing tools and techniques to support you, ranging from yoga, breathwork, sound healing, grief composting, ecstatic dance, voice activation, somatic experiential learning, playful self-expression, and conscious dining. Mandala, sacred circle, is a symbol of the universe in its ideal form, and its creation signifies the transformation of a universe of suffering into one of joy. Through building together a living earth mandala, we will deepen into a ceremony of life, honoring the life, deaths, and rebirths that we carry within our stories, our history, and our future. Join Kylie Geese, Camo Lionheart, Zachariah Stone, Monica Fisher, and myself, Adam Reel, as we journey into the heart of our life cycles, nourish our souls and community, energize our body with 2 organic meals, and become a participant of this precious life we get to live. You can get a discounted ticket for Mandala when you purchase it with another person. This is an amazing offer with an opportunity to receive 7 sessions from multiple facilitators at the investment of 1, plus the support and excitement of community engagement. Join us, Mandala, tending to our inner life cycle, July 8th, 9:30 to 6:30 at Sacred Dwelling. For more information, visit sacreddwellingllc.com/events. Click on Mandala, tending to your inner life cycle, and we will see you on July 8th. Anamkara is a gorgeous meditation and healing center, offering daily in-person and virtual services to help bring you back to the center of who you truly are. They serve through a collective of practitioners, healers, and teachers, offering daily meditation classes, one-on-one healing sessions, workshops, personal ceremonies, and private events, plus corporate and team training, all with mindfulness at the core. The center itself is located in the heart of downtown Spokane. Every part of it was built, designed, and curated for you to drop into your calm place. They have a large community space for daily meditation classes and workshops, as well as 2 one-on-one healing rooms, a community kitchen to gather for tea, plus a well-stocked apothecary for you to gather all of your self-care and ritual needs. Hannah Talbot, the owner and founder of Anamkara, dreamed of opening this space for years. It is her ultimate manifestation, and she cannot wait to share it with those in the Spokane community. but also through the virtual ethers, wherever you may be. Pop in for a class today. You can follow them on Instagram to book and stay up to date. Check out the website, the full schedule, meet the practitioners, and view all the offerings. Visit them at anamkarahealing.center. Anam Kara, may you be nourished and ignited. And now an uninterrupted podcast with Yogi Aaron. All right, welcome back to our show. Today I'm talking with a gentleman named Yogi Aaron. Yogi Aaron's work was introduced to me by a really good friend of mine named Steve. And Steve went to Aaron's yoga teacher training about a year ago down in Costa Rica and just came back with excitement, with exuberation, with this muscle activation technique that I had not heard of. And he's like, this. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to learn more about this. So he introduced me to Aaron. And so Aaron is just an amazing human being. So does a lot of stuff. And I love people that just kind of like dip their toe in things and just explore their creativity. So Aaron is an author. He's a podcast host. He's the creator of Hot Nude Yoga, which is amazing. The creator of AYAMA, which we'll kind of talk about today. And then on top of that, 30 plus years in the yoga industry, just teaching people, looking at bodies, working with different bodies. And that length of knowledge in one area just births so many cool nuances that you can't just read in a book, right? Those many bodies that you work with and the amount of injuries and the traumas in the bodies, and everybody has a different story, and so approaching it from that aspect of like, how can I help this body rather than like, hey, I have all this knowledge that you should fit into. I love that. And so when Steve introduced me to your work, it just kind of blew a hole open in my practice that I didn't know I needed to blow it open. So I'm really excited to talk to you about AYAMA and just you as a person and the journey that you've had in life. So first off, just thanks for being here, man. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Adam. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So with muscle activation technique, AYAMA, the kind of the practice that you've developed, in being in yoga for 30 years. So when did this kind of mentality start to enter into the way that you approach yoga or the way that you approach the human body?
Yeah, and I had started to hear ideas around the fact that stretching is damaging us from my acupuncturist, actually, whose name is Koji. And Koji is one of the best acupuncturists I've ever been to. He studied in China, then studied here, and then went back to China. So, and then has developed his practice. But one of the things he kept saying to me was, he said many things to me, but one of them was, Aaron, your glutes are not working properly. You need to fire them up. And then I said, well, I'm always working my glutes. I stretch them all the time and, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes, actually, stretching is going to cause them to shut down, and your glutes are already shutting down. And he told me this at a moment and actually repeated it over a few years that I just wasn't receptive to it, So when I tell yoga teachers to stop stretching, and then I get a lot of resistance, and they're like, what about, but,
Yeah.
And I am so empathetic to that. It is not an easy, thing to flip in our minds. So many of us, all of us, not so many of us, all of us have egos, identities that we're attached to. And so for yoga teachers and even yoga people, but yoga teachers, we're attached to the identity that we're a yoga teacher, and we're attached to this idea that stretching is quote unquote our lane, which it, by the way, isn't. That's another conversation. But so I have a lot of empathy for it. So what ended up happening was, by the time I turned 45, so I'm 51 now, so this is about 6 years ago, I ended up in a surgeon's office who wanted to do a spinal fusion in my lower back.
Oof.
And which is a huge, major surgery. The recovery time from a spinal fusion is like a good year and a half.
Oof.
It's about 6 months before you're semi-functional.
Yeah.
And that's if you're doing and following the protocols of rest and exercise and, physical therapy. And if you're not, then you're kind of FUCKED,
Right.
like, you know. And so that was like a huge wake-up call. And I was just talking about ego and being attached to, identity. I mean, I definitely, and to this day still, to some degree, attached to this idea that I am a yoga teacher. I know about the body, and I have some knowledge of it. And at that moment, it was such a blow to my ego because, and I was left kind of floundering for a hot second, like, what have I been doing for all of these years? And so, but that kind of opened up the doorway, for me to go, what am I not doing correctly? Or what do I need to change? What else do I need to embody? And so that kind of led me to, I need to learn more. I don't understand the body as well as I thought I did. And and that kind of led me into the whole muscle activation technique
Oh,
realm.
that's beautiful. And I love that you mentioned the ego part of it because it's so funny because I remember when Steve first mentioned your practice to me, the little one inside me was like, "Nuh-uh." Like, I'm not doing it wrong. What are you talking about? But it's beautiful because in the path that I'm in right now and the healing journey I'm on, that the ego is very strong right now, and
Yeah.
that the understanding of what that message is and what that story is. So it was one of those cool, like, dualistic kind of opportunities for me to, one, learn how to accept new information, but also hear that ego flare up and be like, no, it's
Yeah.
okay. It's okay. New information doesn't mean you've been doing it wrong. It's just how do you integrate that new information in?
Yeah, and I will never ever say to yoga teachers like you're doing it wrong. Um, I think that there's a lot of, and I don't think this is an epidemic in the yoga world. I think it's across all spectrums of anything physical, that it's just a lot of blind leading the blind.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people who make up shit. Can I say that on your
Yes, you
podcast?
can. Most definitely.
There's
100%.
a lot of people that make up shit. And then, ignorant people, when I say ignorant, I mean like new yoga teachers
Hmm.
or new people coming in, look to those bigger teachers who are basically saying shit as gods or as the source of knowledge. And they're the teacher, they're the guru, they're supposed to know something, but they don't.
Right.
And because they've been taught incorrectly. And I'm not just saying that, again, it's not just a problem in the yoga world. Even doctors are telling people to go stretch because they've been told it's a good idea,
Hmm.
but there's no evidence, there's no empirical data supporting those claims. In fact, there's a lot of data now supporting the opposite.
Yeah.
And so I kind of come in and I go, look, if you want to keep stretching, you're going to weaken your neuromuscular connections, which is going to weaken you, which is going to leave you open to vulnerability. If you want to keep stretching, namaste. If you want to get stronger and become pain-free, I'm your guy.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like how I approach it, because I do have a lot of empathy. And I just want to kind of give you one quick example of like something that, yoga teachers say all the time, but never once do yoga teachers ever stop to consider what they're saying. And that's this phrase, open your hips. We
Okay.
need to open our hips. And I kind of have a big standing joke now that opening your hips means if we open our hips, we're going to dislocate our hips. And I don't think that's how we want to walk through life as yogis.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that's perfect because there's a lot of those cues that we put out there, like you just said, like a lot of the cues we put
yeah,
out there that we think we might understand, and maybe
yeah,
in some way it does make sense, but on the masses, what does that actually mean? What are you actually
yes,
saying? And I think there's
yes,
what you said about the teachers just now. I think it hits home really deeply because when I went through my teacher training about 10 years ago, I think it was in that kind of that shift where we went from I'm the teacher, don't question me, just do what I say, I'm the fucking teacher, to
yeah,
hey, let's talk about this, right? How does this pose land with you? And so my training was kind of a bit of both. There was some like opportunities to ask questions, and then there were some like don't ask questions, just do what I say. And no harm, no foul against the person that trained me, but it kind of
yeah,
gave me that understanding of like there is a bit of confusion, right?
Yeah.
And the heart's in the right place, but how updated is the information that we're working with? You
Yes.
know? Yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of it too, Adam, is, which is something I dive deep into in different, my podcasts and different videos, is the history of yoga. And part of, I think there's a couple of problems that have contributed to this stretching idea. And one of them is when even when you open up the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and you see someone, a drawing of this lanky, 90-pound Indian man, you know, in Paschimottanasana, and his forehead, which is a drawing, by the way, of his forehead on his knees. And then we think, okay, we need to stretch. Like that's the pose, and we need to do that pose. And unfortunately, it's been just kind of reinforced over and over and over, but nobody has actually gone and read the scripture,
Hmm.
which is very frustrating to me. I have conversations with people, nobody has actually gone and read the scripture. And this workshop I led, one of the questions I asked at the beginning of the workshop the other day was, what are we teaching people in yoga? What is yoga? And out of 14 or 15 people there, not one person could answer the question.
Hmm.
And I found that so shocking that whereas yoga teachers were kind of moved so far away from what are we actually doing here, that yoga teachers don't even know what they're teaching
Hmm.
anymore. And so that's like, part of the stop stretching thing that I'm doing. It's like, hey, stop stretching. Let's now practice yoga.
There you go. Right on.
So it's kind of like it's a double entendre. It's a loaded statement that has many different ideas behind it. It's not just like stop stretching. Yes, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But it's like let's actually flip the script on what we think yoga is and actually practice yoga.
Yeah. There's something you mentioned earlier about the glute engagement that your teacher was talking to you about. And I
Yep.
remember there was a couple of years back when I finally got comfortable enough in my teaching practice to start working with people on inversions and arm balances and different types of techniques. And there was a gentleman I was working with that already had a very established handstand practice. Like he was already pressing up, he could press down, like all the beautiful things, right? And but I was working with him because he had a lot of low back pain. And when I was working with him, I realized that his low back wasn't firing at all when he would press up in a handstand. So he was basically just pushing all the weight into his shoulders, counterbalancing, and then just forcing his
Mm,
way up. But it was so
yeah.
graceful, you couldn't really tell until we got really dialed into him. And
Yeah.
so worked with him for a little while, like poke, 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 fire, fire, fire. Got the low back, got the upper glutes firing, and then finally got him into another press. And he almost threw himself through the wall because those muscles engaged so much to pull him up that he wasn't used to it, and it just flung him. And so it's like that much of your muscle was not engaged. You were forcing
Yes.
yourself up that much. And that was one of those first ideas for me that's like, what am I not engaging? I'm sitting in every posture like warrior two. I'm like, is my bottom glute firing? Is my back
Yeah.
heel pressed in? And it
Yeah.
was kind of eye opening how much I was just kind of dumping into a lot of the joints that I had, and I wasn't actually engaged. And I think a lot of that had to do with the idea of I've got to stretch. My hamstrings are tight. I can't bend over without bending my knees. I need to remedy that. So I need to force my
Yeah.
way into these stretches. And I still have like hamstring tears that I'm dealing with from years and years ago that I've like wide-legged forward fold just forced myself into.
Yeah.
And so, this information as it comes into me, like I said earlier, my ego was like, nah, but the more I sit with it and I absorb the information, I'm like, man, this lands really deeply with me because I work through compensation injuries constantly every day
Yeah.
and didn't even really realize it until maybe within the last year or so.
Yeah. I mean, the body is, you're always going to be able to get from point A to point B. And the body is a genius when it comes to recruiting
Hmm.
muscles that have no business doing the job. And one of those examples, like I used to be a huge Ashtanga person
Hmm.
back in the day. And I can't tell you how many times I would start a practice either in a class. I have very clear memories of being in classes and so excited to take class with a specific teacher. Second, third, fourth, sun salutation A. I would either be coming down or coming up, and my back would seize up on me,
Oh.
like right at the beginning. And so, that I didn't know then that it was because my trunk flexors weren't working properly
Mm.
and not contracting properly, ergo stabilizing my trunk and spine. And so as I'm coming forward, because they're not contracting, my erector muscles were compensating as I'm moving into a forward bend, which is not their job at all. Their
Right.
job is not to support the torso in a lengthened state. Their job is to shorten as we come into back bending. So, and like you, I made the fatal mistake of thinking, "Oh my God, my hamstrings are too tight and they're pulling on my lower back, and that's what's causing my back to seize up," which was not true at all. And then of course my hamstrings are tight, but which I never really dealt with the issues. And so that's kind of like where we're starting to flip the script also on stretching and flexibility. It's like understanding that range of motion isn't dependent on how much a muscle can lengthen, it's actually in how much a muscle can shorten,
Mm.
which is, the definition of muscle function.
That's it's so counterintuitive to what I was taught. I was always taught
Very.
the lengthening, the lengthening, lengthening. It was never the contraction of the muscle. And
Yes.
I've been able to listen to the a few of the podcasts that you've released, and that was one of those things that hit me when you started talking about the contraction of the counter muscles, and it's like,
Yeah.
wow, I didn't, there's ideas that you think about that, like say when you're stretching, right? When you're stretching, let's say you go into back bend, squeezing your glutes so you can open up your hip flexors more, right? Like that
Yes.
stuff I get, but the stretching part of it, the other side of that, for some reason, it just didn't connect until I started listening to your content. And I'm like, oh, that makes so
Yeah.
much more sense. So with
Can I
muscle
just
active.
say one thing
Oh,
about
please.
that, which
Yeah.
is something that blows my mind? And you and I in grade school learned this. We learned the idea of agonist and antagonist
Mm.
muscle. We learned it in biology class. And then I think at some point it was reinforced a little bit in, gym classes. And that's like the thing that just kind of blows my mind is like, why aren't we talking about that more? Instead, we've kind of gone the other way, which is so counterintuitive to what muscle function actually is.
Mm.
So what I'm talking about, and I'm just kind of saying this because I don't, what I'm saying isn't a new idea. It's something that we all know, but we've never put into practice. We've never talked about. And yeah, so anyways, I just wanted to kind of add
I
that.
love that. I've got this silent crusade going that why aren't we teaching our children how to use the bodies we're born with, and why are we waiting until they're in their 20s and 30s to let them go out and find their own ways to breath work and to meditate and to
Yes.
dial into the body we're born with? Like, why don't we have a manual that we can have a class, multiple classes on how to manage the body, and not who signed whatever independence declaration at whatever time? That doesn't fucking matter when we're 30, 40 years old anyways, right?
Yes.
So like
Yes.
that just okay, that's going to go into that curriculum that I've got in my head about how to teach these kids how to use their bodies properly. So practicing yoga for so long, when did muscle activation kind of come into it, and how did you integrate that before getting into your own iteration of AYAMA?
Yeah, so after I ended up in the surgeon's office, I had made a decision to start learning more. And I then I had already been introduced to muscle activation technique. Now, muscle activation technique was just created for all intent and purpose by Greg Roscoff, and he has the MAT school in Denver, Colorado. I had been seeing an MAT therapist who was one of my students and became one of my friends over time, Eric Steibel, who's now located in LA. And I know you're in Seattle, and I know that there's some muscle activation technique therapists there. And I kind of was like, it just dawned on me, it kind of dropped through. I call them spiritual downloads. Like you just get a download during meditation or something. And I had this download, like I should go do this course. So I talked to Eric about it. And I was really concerned because I'm not a very scholastic academic person. And so I was a bit afraid of, my school like fears because I failed every science class,
Okay.
science, biology, chemistry. I always got like F's,
Yeah.
everything. And so kind of like, and anytime we had to kind of like draw in like where muscles were, I always failed those. I was terrible with that. It never was interesting to me. And but so he said to me, Aaron, you're gonna love this. You're already 50% there. So I thought, well, why not? The worst thing that can happen is I'll do the course, I'll fail it, but maybe I'll learn something. And so I decided to do it, and it immediately captured my attention.
Mm.
And one of the missing links, I think, in why I wanted to add this because you mentioned education earlier
Mm.
of teaching kids. The missing link for me was the kinetic part. It's like we learn, like, when you do those diagrams and you fill them out, it's like this is where the quads are, this is where the vastus medialis is. But it's not real until I got my fingers on it, until
Mm.
I started touching it,
Yeah.
until I started palpating it on people. I was like, oh, that's where it attaches to. And so it kind of got kinetically reinforced into my brain. And I realized, like in yoga teacher trainings, and you probably might have had this experience where I think back when you did yours, there was 20 hours of required anatomy and physiology. Now
Hmm.
it's 30 with Yoga Alliance.
Okay.
But people do that like me, and some teachers will just either A, get people to fill in a coloring chart, or B, they'll have a professional come in, and the professional will talk for X amount of time, which honestly sounds like rah, 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 rah. And so you don't remember it. You might find it fascinating. You might go, oh my God, that was a lively discussion if they're really good. But then 3 hours later, you don't remember a darn thing. And so that's how I came up with the applied part. And as I was doing the course, I realized that the missing link was that experiential anatomy part
Hmm.
that I was needing to kind of embody it. And so as I was doing this, I started, like, how can I recreate my own anatomy training in my own yoga teacher trainings? Because I realized I knew it was a weak part of my own trainings. And that kind of inspired me to start creating this more experiential side, if you will, of anatomy. And then, of course, bringing in the muscle activation. So what I teach is not muscle activation technique. That's very a therapeutical aspect, if you will.
Hmm.
What I did was I took the best parts of muscle activation technique and said, how can I do fit this into a yoga practice? How does this start to weave into a yoga practice? And that's how AYAMA was born. So it was AYAMA, the AYA, the applied yoga anatomy. It could have been called actually experiential anatomy.
Hmm.
And then bringing that kind of into it as well as the muscle activation.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I share that story about anatomy, and I think I had a little bit of both in my teacher training, where I had an amazing human come in to talk about anatomy, and also had the
Yeah.
colorful charts that we filled out. And for me, I mean, God, it's like you're just telling my story personally. Like I was so fascinated with it, and like this is amazing. I was always crap in science and all this stuff, and this was
Yeah.
beautiful. And then as soon as a human got in front of me, I'm like, quad. That's about all I remember. And it was a
Yeah.
while before, like, working with the bodies and like you said, putting hands on the bodies and seeing that. But that didn't happen until I got into my own teaching practice and followed my
Yeah.
own inquisitiveness, and I love. There's a 500-hour class or course that a friend of mine took that actually got to work with cadavers in their anatomy part because it was more of
Wow.
anatomy based. They wanted to do more anatomy in their 500 hours, so they kind of focused towards that. And the school
Yeah.
they went to gave them, God, I think it was almost 75 to 100 hours on cadavers. And just like being
Wow.
able to like move tissues and see the myofascia and like see where the muscles and tendons insert and all this stuff. And it was like,
Yeah.
if that was my jam and that's what I wanted to continue on with and deepen, like that's 100% where I would go with that
Yeah.
hands-on, like just love that information in there.
Yeah.
So for that, so how did that change the way that you taught yoga?
Well, the first thing, obviously, is to stop stretching. And that was, I think, one of the hardest things for me personally
Yeah.
to kind of get over because it's like I had to kind of rewrite all the postures. And as I started, when I really started to develop everything and put it into quote unquote a curriculum was during the lockdown.
Mm,
And that was when I really started to practice it, and then kind of go, okay, well, how would I practice Paschimottanasana differently? How would I practice Prasarita, wide leg forward fold differently? How would I practice Trikonasana, triangle pose differently?
hmm
And what I started to realize, well, taking into the idea, okay, we're not stretching, so what are we doing? Well, that's when I started to kind of put the pieces together over. It took me a couple of years. It wasn't like an instant, like snap your fingers. It was a lot of experimentation and inquiry and playing around with this. But it started to realize what is moving the bones in this posture. So, like take Trikonasana.
hmm
So in Trikonasana, we're coming into the side bend. How do normally teachers cue it? Well, there's a lot of different cues. I'm not going to say all of them, but one of them is to feel the stretch on the side body.
hmm
Well, that's actually not what we're doing in Trikonasana. What is moving the torso in Trikonasana is not the side that's being stretched, it's actually the side that's shortening. And so that's where I always say the first thing in AYAMA is stop stretching. The second part is start activating. So instead of focusing on the side that's stretching, I'm focusing more on what is actually shortening. What are the muscles that are actually shortening? And let's work on not just getting them to shorten, but getting them to shorten in a better way. How can we start to get them to become stronger, become more activated?
hmm
So then I started to slowly I call them release valves. It's just my own wording. Sometimes you hear yoga teachers say that too.
Okay.
But a release valve is like one release valve is when I drop into my flexibility. So you used the word earlier, dumping in the hips.
hmm
And so you actually see everybody when they're doing Trikonasana just dump into the hips. So then the question is, well, how can we set this pose up differently to take away people's opportunities to go into their flexibility or dump into their hips or go into their release valves? And so I've started to systematically just kind of going through different postures and just teaching them in a different way to take the flexibility, the quote unquote flexibility slash stretching out of the pose. And then the third part of it, so first part, stop stretching, start activating, and bringing in more muscle activation practices so that people, when we are setting up for certain poses, that we're better prepared. Like for example, wheel pose.
Okay.
So many yoga people are dealing with shoulder injuries more than we can, shake a stick at. It's just incredible.
Yep.
But I think that and knee issues too. Knee issues are a huge one. And so if we look at the way people traditionally set up for wheel, it's no wonder why the stress of that pose is going into the shoulders and into the knees. So the question then becomes, well, if I'm doing this pose, what do I need to do biomechanically to prepare us for this pose? What muscles need to shorten properly to create stability in the joints? And of course, the big joint here is the hips
hmm
and lower back and upper back too, absolutely. So when those are stabilizing properly, guess what? There's no more stress in the knees and in the shoulders as we come into these poses.
Yeah. So with like say for wheel, for example, like you just gave, so it's not that you're trying to stop the stretching of, let's say, the front side body. It's that you're more focused on the engagement of, let's say, the glutes and the hamstrings to push up to feel the engagement of those muscles, and then naturally those antagonist muscles will start to stretch. Is that kind of what you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I would never cue a stretch. I would
Okay.
never say feel the stretch. I would never ever say that. I might say something like feel your heart opening
Hmm.
or feel the prana expanding through the front body. I might say something like that, probably. But I would never ever use the word stretching. And this is kind of, I mean, this is getting into semantics a little bit,
Yeah.
but since you brought it up, it's a little argumentative whether or not the muscles are the agonist, as you said, the antagonist, I'm sorry. The antagonist, as you said, is stretching. I would actually argue, so just for your listeners,
Hmm.
like when a muscle is contracting, that's the agonist, and the opposite muscle is releasing, or sometimes people say stretching. I would just say it there's a natural elongation.
Hmm.
And that elongation, it's important to understand, Adam, that the antagonist, the opposite muscle, in this case, the front body, as you come into wheel, if the back body is shortening, the agonist, the front body will only lengthen as much as the agonist, the opposite muscles are contracting. So that's really an important idea. So people are always complaining, for example, about tight hamstrings.
Hmm.
Well, tight hamstrings are a sign that the quads are not engaging properly. And so so I would never, ever, ever stretch my hamstring. I would, if I knew that my hamstring was tight, it's actually a sign, an indication, a check engine light, if
Hmm.
you will, of the engine that the quads are not contracting properly. And so what I would never do is stretch my hamstrings. What I would do if my hamstrings were tight, it's like, you know, red light, red light, red light. I need to do something about this. I would then get to work on making sure my hip flexors were activated.
Okay, so it's interesting because what kind of pops into my head is like a safety part of it, where
Yes.
there's that focus. Let's take that wide-legged forward fold where you're like pull your chin to the mat, right? Take the
Yeah.
take the bend out of your spine. So
Yeah.
instead of that focusing on, let's say, the lengthening of the hamstrings, which we don't really know when to stop until it hurts, right?
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on that, we're focusing on the engagement of the quads, which are going to naturally pull. And if this makes sense in my head, the muscles are really smart. So this quad isn't going to over pull the hamstring. It's going to pull enough to where you feel safe, to where that feels engaged, and the hamstring
Yeah.
behind it is going to lengthen in that counter amount, but not into an unsafe space where
Yeah.
because we're not pulling ourselves down into a quote unquote stretch, we're letting that antagonist muscle engage. The agonist muscle, excuse me, engage so that we can find that natural lengthening of the antagonist muscle.
Yeah, and the natural one, and also too, like, if your hamstrings are tight coming forward, the muscles tightening up is a sign of instability. When the
Mm,
body senses instability, it tightens up. And this is a fact because if you step on ice, your body is going to tighten up. It's a natural biomechanical response.
mm,
So the absolute wrong thing to do, and I mean this on every sense of the word, wrong, physically, mentally, spiritually, is to violate the body's own protective mechanisms.
mm.
And so the correct way in would be then to go, oh, my body's tightening up. Where is the instability sourced from? So if following your example with prasarita, prasarita, padottanasana, wide leg forward fold, if my hamstrings were tight, I would go, oh, it could be the trunk flexors are not engaging properly. I'm coming forward without any stability in the trunk flexors. It may not be just the quads. It also could be the trunk flexors. I can't tell you how many times I've done this experiment on myself and on many people where I come into a seated forward fold and they're like, "Oh my God, my hamstrings are tight. I can't go forward far enough
Yeah.
or that far." I get them down. We go through maybe one or two different muscle activations just on the trunk flexors, aka core muscles. Come back up, the hamstring tightness is gone. And so the hamstring tightness could also be a sign like other areas of the body are not functioning properly. Other muscles are not connecting properly. And so what we want to do is then make sure, like, use these things as a tool for us to kind of do a self-analysis. Where is there instability? And one of the things that my teacher, Greg Roskoff of a muscle activation technique, always says is like when you have stability, you have all the mobility you want or need.
Hmm.
And but not only do you have mobility, but you also have stability in that mobility. If you just kind of fold forward into a pose like wide leg forward fold and don't address the tightness, don't address the instability, instead you kind of force the hamstring to release. When you come back up, you're now weaker. Not only are you weaker, you've now shut down like at least four groups of muscles.
Hmm.
When I say four groups of muscles, I mean trunk flexors, trunk extensors, your trunk, your hip extensors, your hip flexors. All of these muscles are no longer working properly. And we know that because we can test them. So what I'm saying isn't just something I've kind of like believe or think about. People always say to me like, well, that's an interesting philosophy. Well, yeah, but I can actually test it. And I can test you before and I can test you after. And there was a girl in the workshop last weekend in the teachers workshop that I did at the yoga studio, and people actually saw with their own eyes. I got her range of motion to improve through improving the contraction of the trunk flexors of the abdominal muscles. Let's just say that for your listeners, just
Yeah.
for simplicity, of the abdominal muscles and trunk flexors. And then I shut them down. I actually turned them off by stretching them in a very gentle way. It wasn't a forced way. It didn't cause any pain, just
Yeah.
for people to know that. And then I came back and I said, do the forward fold again. She lost her range of motion. Her range of motion was actually worse than it was before I did the very first test.
Yeah.
So not only do we lose stability, but we actually lose range of motion, which you think like, well, I'm stretching to become more flexible. I'm stretching to get more mobility. You actually lose mobility when you start to stretch.
Wow. And so, one of the things that comes to me when you're talking about that is, one of the reasons I got into yoga was to
Yeah.
reestablish that body mind connection, or actually just, establish it for a first point. And, and it's funny because like we listen to our bodies, we're taught to, now we're listening. And so this information that comes in shows that like maybe we're not really listening to our body. We're listening to what somebody tells us to listen to about our body. And that's kind of one of those another one of those egoic things of like, shit, am I
Yeah.
doing this? I've been doing this wrong now. I've been trying to, work within my body, and now I'm doing that wrong. So, working with people's egos, whether it's a teacher or a student that's been doing
Sure.
this, how do you kind of approach that sense of defeat that somebody might have, and then help them integrate this information into their practice so that it embraces and accompanies their practice instead of like, a lot of times we'll just be like, well, shit, now I can't do that right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really just really again just flipping the script. And how do you do that? Well, you have to start to educate yourself.
Yeah.
And there's different ways to do that. But one thing I want to comment on, and I'll circle back to that question, is this idea of listening to the body. And it kind of like dawned on me one day, 'cause I was reflecting on my own experience more than my students, that I had been listening to my body and I still ended up in a surgeon's office.
Mm.
And so I kind of realized like as yoga teachers, us telling students to listen to their bodies is a cop out.
Mm.
And again, it's like the blind leading the blind there. Even doctors now will tell their patients, listen to your body. And it's like, it's kind of ridiculous. I don't speak Japanese.
Yeah.
I can listen to somebody speak Japanese and I can, okay, I'm listening, but I don't understand anything what they're saying.
Uh-huh.
So, so many of us don't understand the language of our bodies. In my new AYAMA course that I'm putting together an AYAMA online training.
Hmm. Beautiful.
But I think I can't remember now if it's in the first or second series. Um, but I put this whole thing about listening to the body. And one of the ways that we can start to listen to our body is by paying attention to tightness, paying attention to where there's restriction of movement. And so when we start to pay attention to that tightness, we then the second step is, well, what is that tightness telling me? Well, the tightness is telling me that there's an instability somewhere. So where is that instability? That's one thing to pay attention to. Another one is pain.
Hmm.
And so, in yoga, the way that we kind of address pain is avoid it. But what I would actually propose is be inquisitive again. Ask like hip pain. Hip pain is a common thing in for yoga people. Well, why is that hip pain there? What muscles are not working properly? The hips are, so pain is always the sign of inflammation. There's inflammation there. Inflammation is due to stress and trauma and overuse. So why is there stress at that joint? And let's use the hips again.
Hmm.
Why is the stress? Well, there's stress there because the hips are like not stabilized properly, probably because they've been open too much. Um, but the real, so with me and my acupuncturist, Koji kept saying to me, Aaron, your hip problems is because your glutes are not working properly. They're not contracting properly. And just as a side note, one of the muscles that was like my nemesis was my piriformis.
Okay.
Well, what are we doing all the time when we're stretching our hips is we're stretching our glutes. All these hip openers are overstretching the glutes, which leaves you debilitated and unstable after. Well, the body's going to recruit whatever muscle it can. It recruited my piriformis, and most people's piriformises are tight,
Hmm.
which is a hip rotator. For those of people who are listening, it's a major hip rotator. But the piriformis will start to take on a characteristic of the glutes.
Interesting.
But if you look at the piriformis and see how small it is, oh my God, it's not meant to do extension. It does play a role in some extension, but the glutes aren't working. The body again is going to recruit whatever muscle it can.
Yeah.
So this poor little tiny muscle starts getting overused and stressed out. Well, that's going to create pain in the hips. And what do? We go and stretch our hips
Right.
more.
Exactly.
It keeps exacerbating the cycle. So we need to kind of like pay attention to the pain. What is the pain, and then be inquisitive and go, well, where's the source of this pain? What are the muscles around there? What is the opposite muscle? So one time I went out for a walk, and I walk a lot. It's my exercise. And my inner groin was really sore.
Mm.
Within like 300 meters of me leaving the house. And I was going for like an 8 kilometer walk. It's like 5 miles. And I kind of like dropped in, and of course, being a yoga person, my initial intention or initial idea was to stretch it.
Yeah.
But I knew then I was like, no, don't stretch it. What's the source? So if I had inner groin pain, the opposite muscle would be my glutes. So I just kind of stopped and I did this one quick standing hack to get my glute med working, my abductors. Not only did the groin pain disappear, it never came back for the
Wow.
rest of the walk. And, had I did stretch it, I would not only have exacerbated the groin pain because it would have come back, but I never would have dealt with the instability issue, which was that my glute med wasn't contracting properly.
Mm.
And so because it wasn't working, my groin started tightening up. And so that's kind of like where we're going with this is trying to go in and use the pain to go, okay, the pain is telling me that there's instability. Where is the source of that instability? And that takes time. I mean, it takes time to understand that and learn it, but that's also, I think, part of the fun process of it all.
Yeah, most definitely being that inquisitive mind. What
Yes.
what's your so with all of this, what's your take on the practice of yin yoga?
Or Steve told me the other day, like we were messaging, and he said something like, I'm having a lot of fun trying to find ways to incorporate AYAMA into yin. And I wrote him back and I just said, I just want to kindly remind you that yin is completely to everything that AYAMA stands for.
Yeah.
So the two are very philosophically, biomechanically, the two just do not have any room to meet at
Yeah.
all. Because yin is like, how much can we stretch tissue?
Right.
And Yama says, okay, well, the natural function of tissue is actually to shorten, to create stability and move bones properly. So yin is like completely opposite to that. I
Yeah.
will just say one thing to listeners, like, I think you should just stop stretching. I know from my own experience, my own lived experience and the experience of others, that if we take out stretching, we do feel better. And a friend of mine who runs marathons, um, for the first time for this last marathon she ran, because she hadn't run them in a little while. She said to me a couple of things, but one, she said she hadn't stretched at all. Two, that she felt stronger than she ever had. And three, she wasn't in pain that she normally had experienced in training leading up to the marathon. And so there's that. But if you are going to stretch, the best time to stretch, there is no best time to stretch. But if you really feel like, oh my God, I have to stretch
Mm.
because I just have to, then do it before you go to bed.
Mm.
Because you saw you when you stretch, you're shutting down your muscles. You have no stability in your body. At least you go to your bed where there's no accountability. You're just lying there. So you can't hurt yourself,
Yeah.
from you debilitating your body. So if you are going to stretch, do it before you go to
Wow.
bed.
I love that. Is there, so it like taking the word stretch out of it, is there
Yeah.
like a muscle activation or an AYAMA like counter or, supplementation of like, say, let's say like I'm just used to stretching, like my hamstrings are tight, so I stretch every night or whatever it is. So what would the counter be for AYAMA or for muscle activation? Would it be, let's say instead of like sitting down and doing a forward fold and focusing on the lengthening of the hamstrings, maybe
Yeah.
sit down and get postured right and just focus on the engagement of the quads? And so I think what I'm trying to say is like, so let's say I'd hold a stretch for 30 seconds and focus on the stretch. Would, instead of focusing on that stretch, would I still hold a posture similarly for like say 30 seconds and focus on the engagement of the counter muscle?
Yeah, I so there's a couple of ways to think about this, but one is, so there's a couple of answers I want to give. Hopefully I can remember them as you were talking. But the first of all, like, so if you're lying on your back and you're doing a hamstring stretch, Supta Padangusthasana, and you normally cue it, so you're reclined, leg stretch.
Hmm.
So you're lying on your back, you bring your leg up. How normally teachers would cue it is say, bring a strap to the foot or grab your foot or grab your leg and pull the leg towards you. So that's a passive stretch. That's passively moving the leg closer to your torso. What I would say then is take the hands out of it. So dynamically bring the leg up and
Mm.
hold the leg there. Now, how many times should you do that? There's a couple of ways that you can just do it. You can, do it as a series. So do slowly bring the leg up. And when I say slowly, like maybe count to 5, 6, 7, slowly bring the leg up, hold it there for 2 seconds, and then slowly lower it down, and just do that many reps.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, now you're actually exercising the quad muscle. In MAT, or sorry, muscle activation, one of the general rule is 6 seconds, 6 times. So another way to do it could be to bring the leg up and hold it there for 6 seconds, and keeping the leg as extended as possible. So don't let the knee bend. So you bring it up as far as you can. It could be 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, 110 degrees, whatever it is, whatever your natural range of motion is. So that could be one way to that's how one way that you can start to apply a yama
Hmm.
into your yoga class. With your seated forward fold, Adam, again, I want to come back to the initial conversation. What is yoga?
Hmm.
What are we really trying to do in yoga? So Patanjali said stiran sukhamasana, which means, easy and still is our posture. And so that word stira really means, it means a couple of things. It means still and it means steady or stable. So how stable can we be in this pose? So part of that then is kind of again changing our the way that we think about postures. Postures, yoga asana is a way for us to be able to pull our mind inward, pull our senses inward to fully inhabit a pose so we can start to um, cultivate that stability at just an asana level. Of course, two steps in the Ashtanga system is pratyahara, so we're experiencing sensory withdrawal. So pulling the sense inward. So then the question is, well, how far do we really need to go?
Right.
How much, you know, so whenever I teach a lot of forward folds now, I teach most forward folds. Either I'll cue it one of two ways. One, I'll cue them just sitting tall. So instead of coming forward in Paschimottanasana, make it more of like a Dandasana pose
Mm-hmm.
so that, the hands are to the sides and close your eyes and feel the spine lengthening. For me, it's more important of what's going on in the spine than the actual pose. The second way I'll cue it is maybe to bring the hands behind the back and then come forward. And sometimes if I have a lot of really flexible people, I will be specific and just say, come forward 10 or 20%.
Hmm.
Sometimes I'll say, come forward as far as you can, but keep the spine extended. So don't allow yourself to round. And I'll do that with bringing the hands behind the back. So that way people can't, dump into their flexibility. It doesn't give them an option to reach and grab something and pull themselves forward.
Hmm.
When their hands are behind the back, now there's 100% accountability because they can only go as far as their muscles are contracting.
Yeah.
They can only go as far as their core is contracting and their quads are going to shorten. They can't go beyond that end range of motion. So there's 100% accountability in that pose for them to do it. So one of the questions that I often say to yoga teachers specifically, but I'll say to anybody who practices yoga, why are you doing this pose?
Hmm.
And answer that question first. Well, if I'm doing this pose to stretch, okay, be honest about that. You're
Right.
no longer doing yoga. If you're just stretching, you're not really doing yoga. If you're doing this pose because you want to fully inhabit your body and you want to pull your mind inward and you want to feel the elongation, the extension, quote unquote, of the spine, well, now it's a whole different practice.
Yeah.
And the way that we approach the pose then opens up the possibility for something more potent to happen. So when we go to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which I quoted at the beginning of class or the podcast, that doing Paschimottanasana, the promise is that the pranic forces become so enlivened in the Sushumna Nadi, which is quote unquote the spine. The pranic forces become so enlightened that the yogi can reach enlightenment.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a great promise,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So that's why it's important to understand energetically what is going on in the pose. And when we start to understand what's energetically going on, chronically going on in the poses, and that, by the way, is all in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. When we start to understand the chronically what's going on, we realize we don't actually have to go that far. You know, I always say to my, people on backbending day when I'm doing backbends on teacher trainings, and of course, people have a lot of fears about
Oh
backbends.
yeah.
I say, everybody, bring your arms up to the sky. Now, bring your biceps a little bit behind the ears. Now you're doing a backbend.
Hmm.
You feel that expansive nature of the pose. Now you're doing backbending. You don't have to come into wheel pose to do a backbend.
Yeah.
You just got to bring your arms up, lift your chest. Now you're doing a back bend, and you're getting all the energetic benefits of that back bend, the same benefits as if you were doing wheel pose. It's exactly the same energetically. The warp, I'm a huge Trekkie. The warp signature is exactly the same.
There you go. Well, I think this also reminds me of, and I know you're tight on time, so I'll make this statement, then we'll close out here. But it kind of reminds me of the idea that instead of trying to slam your body into the picture of a posture, you're
Yeah,
listening to the way the posture fits with your personal body. And I think that was was one of the biggest messages that it took me a while to understand. It's like there's, let's say triangle again. There's triangle, right? You have your hips open, your hands on the ground, the arms up
Yes.
there, your spine straight. Well,
Yeah.
a person that's been doing yoga 2 days isn't going to be able to get their hand to the ground in a safe way, right? And so why am
Yeah.
I trying to slam my body into this shape instead of like, how does this shape land with me? And I think,
Yeah.
what you're saying to me kind of echoes all of that in like, what questions are you asking? How inquisitive are you being about what's being taught to you instead of just like taking it for what it is and just throwing yourself into it?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of that. And it's also like, again, just asking the question, what are we doing in this pose?
Yeah.
So what is the intention? And then where Yama comes in is goes, okay, well, if we're doing this pose, what muscles are shortening and how can we use this pose to improve muscle function, and or how can we improve muscle function to experience this pose in a deeper way? So some of the poses are fun, like we were talking about handstand earlier.
Hmm.
I love doing handstands, but let's make sure that the body is biomechanically prepared for it first, so that we can go and enjoy the expansive, energizing, nature and effects of handstands.
Definitely. Most definitely, man. Well, Aaron, I think we could probably talk for another hour, so I'm gonna but flag this
Easily.
for another future conversation. But they just for this hour that we've been able to spend together, thank you for sharing your information and your time. Like I said when we started this, I love when new information comes across my path and to see how it integrates with my practice. And from the stuff that Steve's introduced me to before we actually had a chance to talk to what you've now kind of given me to marinate on, I feel like there's a blossoming in my practice that's going to happen, and I'm really appreciative of that. So for Aaron, for Yogi Aaron, if you want to get in touch with him and learn more about AYAMA or any of the books he's written, the podcast that he has out there, the podcast is called Stop Stretching. One of the books he's written is called Stop Stretching, and it's beautiful content. It's really well done. I love the approachability of it, and so if you want to learn more about Yogi Aaron, I'll have some stuff in the show notes. But man, thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited to kind of marinate on this a little bit deeper and to find some topic streams to have you back. I feel like we could have another really cool conversation in the future.
I would love that. This has been just a great conversation, and I hope you can sense my passion in all of this stuff. So
100%,
thank you
man.
so much for having me on.
Yeah. Best of luck to you in your journeys, my friend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending time with Yogi Aaron and I. Please check out the show notes for links to get in touch with Aaron, to learn more about AYAMA, to learn more about his books, his podcasts, all the beautiful things that Aaron offers to the world. Obeisance and love. We'll see you next time.